That whistle at the end just like sets that video off for me. Whistling's a talent that not many people can do well. But anyways, I just wanted to get it out of the way. A lot of people first service said I looked like Steve Jobs, and I wanted to dispel that myth that I'm not him. And I will not be debuting Apple products this morning, but we're going to jump right into our series Bystander, and I'm really excited about it. I've been studying this, the topics and where we're heading for the next couple weeks. I've been studying it for the past month or so with Jim, and really excited about the content that we're going to present over the next several weeks leading up to Easter. And so before we get into kind of what Bystander is all about, I want to dispel kind of talk about a tension that we're going to talk about over the next several weeks. And it's really this thought that there's two words that we believe are two of the most misused, most misunderstood words that are in the use in Christianity or in religion in general. And the funny thing about them is if you plug them into any other facet of your life, you know what they mean, you use them correctly, and they make sense. But when we start talking about Jesus and Christianity, they start to take on like a whole different meaning. And so those two words are this: faith and believe. Faith and believe. Like in our everyday life, or in our work life, or maybe in our relationships, or those types of things, when we talk about belief, like it's always grounded in what? In evidence, right? Like you believe based on evidence, most of us. And where you get that evidence is usually sometimes you read about things, or you hear about them, you watch something, someone told you something, and you start to believe. That's where your belief comes from, is usually evidence that someone gives to you in one form or another. But the other way is this, is that we believe kind of based on the confidence in the person delivering that information to us. A good example of this would be your teachers growing up. When they taught you things in school, you usually believed them because who would hire a person to come and teach kids that doesn't know what they're talking about? Like maybe when you were in school, you might have thought that about your teacher, but they were there because the people in authority over them had confidence in their abilities to teach. And so when you were taught, 6 times 6 is 36, you probably believed them. I doubt you went home and grabbed a bunch of popsicle sticks and you laid them out and like, I'm going to prove this teacher wrong. You had confidence in their abilities to know what they're talking about. But sometimes you don't really know what you believe because there's, two sides to every story, and, there's all this evidence that points to this, but then there's evidence that points to that, and so you don't really know which side to believe in. And so there's a thing called confirmation bias, where you just kind of believe the one that you like the most, or the thing you want to agree with the most. Here, like a good example, a very important question in my mind is, do you think coffee is good for you? Like that might be the most important question of the day, considering a lot of you are holding cups of coffee in your hands. But is coffee good for you? It always used to be good for you, and everyone loved it, and they said, oh, drink coffee, you'll live longer. And then all these reports came out that said coffee's bad for you. You can't drink coffee. You're going to shorten your life. It's got all those oils and the cholesterol. It's really bad for you. And then all these other studies came out and said, no, coffee's great for you. It's good for your mind. It's good for, warding off dementia and all of these things. And so you don't know what you believe, but if you love coffee, you're going to believe the reports that say, I love coffee and it's healthy for me. Unless you live in California where everything's bad and it's going to kill you. And they put warnings on everything, right? But you believe you use this confirmation bias, and we all kind of participate in that in one form or another. But in religion in particular, or in Christianity more specifically, for some reason, religious faith and belief are often divorced from reason and confused with hope. And that might be a real kind of like hard thing to read sitting in church this morning. But we believe that oftentimes when people start talking about their faith and they start talking about, their belief, that they're actually getting confused with reason, or it's divorced from all reason, for all kind of, evidence, and it's confused with hope. And hope is a great thing. But hope's not the same thing as faith, is what we're going to learn about today. You can hope that you're going to do well on that test, right? Like, I didn't study at all for this test, but I hope I'm going to do well on that test. You hope you're going to do well, though you've put no work into it. There's no reason you should do well on that test, right? You're just hoping that you will. You can't say, I have faith I'm going to do well on that test, because you have nothing to base that on. Or, oh, I have faith that, that guy I swiped left on Tinder, that he's going to be the one that was in that picture I saw, right? Like, I have faith that that's who that's going to be. But you have nothing to base that on, right? You're just hoping that he is the person that you saw. You're hoping he's not an axe murderer, right? But you don't know. You don't have faith in that because you're not sure. You've never met this person before. That's not faith. That's hope. You could say, like, I just have faith. I invited, my cousin out, and they've been struggling with addiction and all this stuff, and I just have faith that they're going to come to church, And, well, did they come last week? Well, no, they didn't come last week, but I just have faith that they're going to be there. Well, did they come the week before that? Well, no, they didn't come then either. Like, have they ever come to church? Well, no, they've never come, but I just have faith that they're going to be there. And it's like, that's not faith. That's hope. Like, you're hoping that they're going to show up, but there's no faith involved in that because you have nothing to base. There's no history of them doing that. You have nothing to base that on. And this makes it so difficult because many of us in life, like we come to church and we grew up and, our Sunday school teachers, they said all this stuff. And then, we're living the life and then some hardship happens. We go through a rough patch in life. We get a bad diagnosis or something happens, or we lose our job, and then the road gets hard. Or maybe, we believe one thing and then someone comes and they say, hey, check this video out I saw online. Like, what do you think about this? And then your faith, it starts to shake a little bit. And then someone, maybe comes along and they say, oh, well, I know you have a lot of questions, but, they say this, well, you just have to believe. It doesn't make sense, but you just have to believe, You just have to believe, brother. It's going to be okay. Or maybe they said this. They said, well, you just have to take it by faith, Take the leap of faith, they say. Like, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what that next step's going to be, but just take the leap of faith, You just have to take it by faith. There's no reason to believe that's going to happen, but you just have to go with it. And I know that these are well-meaning statements that people have said. Like, when someone says you just have to believe, I'm sure they weren't trying to deceive you. But the problem with it is that, if we ask the Apostle John, who we're going to talk about a lot over the next several weeks, if you asked him, hey, dude, should I take this whole Jesus thing, and just believe? Should I just, jump into it and just, muster up some faith and just believe it? I think John would say, no, that's not the way it works. I think John would say, that's not what it's all about. Who told you that you just have to believe? You don't have to base it on, you just have to believe. Who told you that? And I think if Jesus, we asked him, why should we believe you? I don't think he would say, well, just take my word for it. You just have to believe. You just muster up a little bit more faith. And I bring this up because there's this guy, his name's Frank Turek. And if you're into big apologetics and stuff, he's a guy who lectures, he travels around, he's big he goes to college campuses and he'll debate people, any day of the week. And he said this. He said, the reason so many people like you, people like me, people like our kids, our parents, so many people are easily talked out of Christianity is because they were never talked into it in the first place. And at first you might feel a little icky about that phrase, you were never talked into it, like you have to convince people. But what he's saying here is that, so many people, they're so easily talked out of Christianity because they were never taught the reason to believe. They were just taught you just have to believe. Just, it's called blind faith for a reason. You don't know, you just got to go. And so what we're going to talk about over the next several weeks is that there's a big difference, a big difference of by faith and because of faith. And we can look at it this way. John, he was a fisherman. John, the Apostle John, who we're going to talk about today, he was a fisherman. His dad was a fisherman. His dad's dad was probably a fisherman. And so he left everything behind, everything he knew to follow Jesus. He left a steady job with his father, probably a future of taking over the family business to follow Jesus. But here's the thing. He didn't leave everything behind to follow Jesus because of faith. Faith didn't cause him to do that. He followed Jesus because of what he saw, because of what he experienced, because of evidence that was laid out that he saw. He followed Jesus because of what he experienced, not because someone just said, hey, you should believe this guy. Let's go. Now, a little bit of history on John. He outlived pretty much every one of his friends. He was a disciple. He walked with Jesus. He was one of the guys that followed him around and was there through it all. And every person that was there with him probably died before John. He was like the last remaining apostle, last one that was really walking with Jesus. And so at the end of his life, he decided, I need to write all this stuff down. And he was probably old in his age, and he dictated the book, is what most people believe, that he didn't pen it himself, but that he actually dictated it because of the way the language is in a lot of it. But the Gospel of John, or the good news according to John, that's what that gospel really means. And I think John, when he set out to write this book, he didn't just want to give you a bunch of really good stories. I don't think he set out to say, I just want to tell people what to believe. I just want to inform people of the things that they need to know. I think John's focus was the why, the how. Why did this all happen? And specifically, why did it happen the way that it did? Why did Jesus do the things that he did? What was the reason behind them? So kind of to start this out, we're going to go to the end of John's book. So we're going to go to the very end in John chapter 20. And this is kind of like if you were writing a term paper or a research paper, you usually have a purpose statement, right? The reason for this paper is this, or your thesis maybe. And John's is at the end of the book, but we're going to look at it. He said this in John chapter 20, verse 30. He says, Jesus performed many other signs. There was many more things that he did. And notice he uses the word signs. We're going to talk more about that, and not the word miracles. But Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples. So he did these with other people around. People saw what he did. This wasn't something that Jesus was like, hey guys, you've never met me. I did these cool things years ago. No one saw them, but just trust me. They happened. He brought people with him, and they saw in the presence of other disciples many other signs that were not recorded in this book. So John tells you there's things that happened that I'm not even going to include in here. There's other things that went on that I don't have time to maybe share in this book. There's only so much paper available, right? Then he's not going to share them all. But the things that he did right, he said, but the things I've included here, they're written for a reason. And the reason is so that you may believe. But what do you want us to believe, John? He says, that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. Here's the whole point of all of this. I wrote all these things down because I want you to believe. And then I want you to not just believe blindly. I want you to believe that Jesus, that he really is the Messiah, that he's the Son of God. And so he keeps going. He's sort of building a case at this point. He says this, and that by believing, so once you have that belief that's based off the evidence, off the signs and the things that that I shared with you prior to this statement in the book, that by believing that you're going to find life in his name. And that's the reason. That's the reason behind all of this. I believe John wrote it down because this is how he came to believe in Jesus. I think that he's going to lay it out, and we're going to dive into that over the next 6 weeks. We're going to look at this case that John builds over the next several weeks, that there were specific events that happened, and then specific signs that Jesus performed that all led to revealing who Jesus is. And the cool thing about the book of John and Matthew and the other Gospels is that these guys struggled. They weren't just die hard, I believe everything right off the bat. They struggled with their belief from time to time. They didn't know how to interpret some of these things. Some of the stuff that John talks about, I think he didn't fully grasp until years and years later when he finally wrote or dictated the stuff that he put in this book. But John lays it out, and he organizes his thoughts around signs. And that's the importance of this, is that he doesn't call them miracles, okay? He writes 7 signs of the things that he puts in there. Because I think that miracles, miracles are really cool. And everyone prays for a miracle. And when a miracle happens, it's unexplained. And it's just this amazing, amazing thing. And I think that John focuses on calling them signs because they point to something. They were signs of something that they revealed in the process. And I think that he does this because he doesn't want us to just be enamored by the miracle itself. Like the things that Jesus did were really cool and they were amazing. And some of them just like defy logic. But instead, he wants us to be enamored with the person that the miracles point to, the reason behind them, not the miracle itself. And so John was very specific in his wording here. So the first sign we're going to look at this week, the first sign is water into wine, and it rhymes, and I think that's cool. So the first sign, it starts in John chapter 2, and we're going to hop right in. It said, on the third day, a wedding took place in Cana in Galilee. And so weddings in this time, these were like big deals. They weren't like our weddings where you plan for months, and then you show up and you do like a 2-hour little shindig, and you say your vows, you have a little party and eat, and then you go home. Weddings in this time were like weeks long. They were like big affairs. And so you had all this stuff that went on during this. And so it says Jesus' mother was there. And so she's, as we're going to learn, she's kind of like the head party planner at this wedding. She's like one of the hostesses. She kind of is making sure that the food's ready, the food's prepared, and all of that. And Jesus and his disciples had been invited to the wedding as well. And this is important because John was one of these disciples. So John's writing this account, and he's telling us, I was there. I was with Jesus. I was with his mother. There was a wedding. It was in Galilee. He gives all of this detail because he wants you to know that this really happened. This was an actual event. And it says, when the wine was gone, because all good parties have wine in the New Testament, right? And so when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother, she says to him, they have no more wine, Jesus. And I wonder, like, was she worried at this point? Did she think, like, the party's just getting started and now we've got no more wine? Like, why did she look to Jesus? Did she have reason before this? This is like the first sign, the first miracle that Jesus does that we have record of. And so we're wondering, like, why does she turn to her son who was invited to the wedding? We don't really know that he's like one of the party planning committee, but he's just there. So why did she focus on Jesus? It makes you think, like, did he do something at home did she know that he could do something about it? Like, was she at home cooking and she's like, I need one more cup of sugar. Jesus, do that thing. Right? Like, just fill this thing up with sugar. It makes you like, we don't know. But she looks to Jesus. She's like, hey, Jesus, we've got no more wine. Okay? And then Jesus does something that's a little bold. Okay? His response is a little bold, and I don't recommend this. He responds and he says, woman. Don't speak to your mom that way. Right? Woman, he says. Not like, yes, what can I help you with? He says, woman. Okay, and the thing about it, though, it's funny and it sounds aggressive, but in reality, like the translation of that's much more formal. It's more like my lady, like he's being respectful to his mom. So Jesus is a good guy. You know, he does respect his mother. And so he says, woman, why do you involve me? Why are you pulling me into this? Why is this my problem to deal with? Right? Like, why are you looking to me? Like, I would almost picture him, and this is probably a bad way to picture Jesus, but like, come on, Mom. Like, why are you pulling me into this whole thing? Like, why is this my fault? You obviously didn't plan for the amount of people that were here. Like, why are you involving me? Jesus replied, my hour has not yet come. So at this point, Jesus, to really the whole world, is just a guy. Okay, he's not like the guy who did the wonders and the miraculous signs and things. So he's thinking like, Mom, like I haven't come out to everybody yet as the Son of God. Like I haven't done my thing yet. Like I wanted it to be this big deal, and you just want me to like stir up some more wine so this party can keep going. But he's like, my hour has not yet come. I'm not ready. I came to save the world, Mom, not the party. Okay, I didn't just come to do party tricks. And so, but even though they were pretty neat. And so the next thing, it says his mother tells to the servants. She looks to them and she says, do whatever he tells you. And then I assume she just walks off, right? Like, hey, servants, we need more wine. This guy over here, do whatever he says. And then she's out, I'm guessing. That's just my intelligence telling me that she does that. But she says, do whatever he tells you. The next step is Jesus's. I don't know how he's going to do it. You're going to have questions. You're probably not going to believe that he's going to do what he does, but just do whatever he asks. So Jesus kind of takes over. It says, nearby stood 6 stone water jars. Okay, these are important. Okay, they're stone, so they're really heavy. The kind they used by the Jews for ceremonial washing. Okay, each one holds, 20 to 30 gallons of water. So these are heavy. Okay, you fill them up with water. No one's moving these things very easily. And they were used for ceremonial washing. And as we know, Jesus, if you've been with us for any length of time, or you've been in some of our past, series, that you know that Jesus came to replace the old with something new. And so the whole symbolism by this is these jars, these ceremonial washing jars, are like icons about the whole Jewish culture. They summed up like the whole practice of the sacrificial system. If they had to perform a sacrifice, there was cleansing that had to be done before and certainly after, and they would use these jars for that. They would fill them with water. They would have to wash maybe to their elbows, maybe their whole body, maybe just their hands. It all depended on what they were doing, but tradition and law taught them that they needed to do these certain things. And a lot of in these Jewish traditions, in this way, this covenant was handed down by God to the Jewish people. And Jesus was saying, get those old jars over there. Bring them over here. I'm going to do something really cool with them. They represent the covenant that God made hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And one, as we will find out over the next several weeks, that Jesus came to replace. He came to bring something brand new. And so the crazy thing is, probably no one understood what he was doing on this. And so years later, probably people were still trying to figure out, what was Jesus doing with that? Why did he pick those jars? But he goes on and says, Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. So they get some water, they fill them right to the top. They're super heavy, and that's all that he does. Just fill those things up, and then we're going to be good. The thing I love about John is he doesn't act like you've never heard this story before. He assumes that everyone already knows this story. And I bet if we had people raise hands, almost everybody here knew that Jesus turned water into wine. Like, we all know that story, or most of us had probably heard it at one point or another. And John writes it the same way. He doesn't give you he doesn't give you the big punchline and then he turned it into wine. He just assumes that you know the story. Like, oh, you remember that time Jesus did that? Yeah, that wine thing, that was cool. And so he fills the jars up. And this guy, F.F. Bruce, and anyone who goes by just two initials, you know they're a very smart person. So he wrote a commentary on the book of John. And he wrote this, and he's talking about this portion of Scripture. And a commentary is like a summary, and when someone writes a commentary, they break down all the verses, they break down each word even in translations, and they try to help you make sense of it all. And this is what he wrote, that the water provided for purification as laid down by Jewish law and custom. So it was a part of their custom, their everyday life, something that they did every single day, their law and their custom that they were used to. It stood or stands for the whole ancient order of Jewish ceremony. This represented their whole life. Their everyday life surrounded these jars and this ceremonial washing. And then it says, which Christ was to replace with something better. Jesus knew that those old ways were going to end with him, that he came to replace all of that. And so he said, I'm just going to start this thing out. So I'm going to take what was old and I'm going to do something brand new with it. It was foreshadowing of what was to come. So they filled the jars up with water. And then Jesus says, he told them, now draw some out of it and take it to the master of the banquet. Okay, he doesn't say now it's wine. He doesn't tell them what's going on. He just says, now draw some water out or draw some out of that and then go take it to the master of the banquet, who this guy's like the head honcho. He's the guy in charge of the banquet. He's not like the family, but he's the one that makes sure that the banquet's ready. He's like the head caterer, I guess you'd say. And so they take it to him. So I'm assuming these servants are a little nervous, right? We're out of wine. You want me to take this to the head guy to have him taste it, to approve it, to be brought into the party. But that's what he tells them. And they, for some reason, do it, probably because Jesus' mom said to do it. And everyone listens to people's moms, right? When it's not your mom, you listen. If it's your mom, you don't listen. I don't know why that is. And so they bring it out to him and says they did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water. Notice how he doesn't say he tasted the wine. He tasted the water, because John he just assumes you know this. And he didn't realize, or he tasted the water that was turned into wine. It says, and he didn't realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. And this is what I think is so amazing about this. Jesus didn't step out in front of the whole wedding party and be like, hey guys, I turned this into wine. The party's back on, right? He just did it with the servants. There was a small group around probably. He just made it happen. And then he just let the news spread from there. So the master of the banquet, he didn't know, but the servants knew. And then this master of the banquet, he called the bridegroom aside, the guy who this whole party's for. Right? He calls him aside. So I'm sure these servants are a little nervous, oh man, it probably tastes like, pond water like it is, and he knows, and we're all going to get fired. It says he didn't realize. So, and then he said to the bridegroom, everyone brings out the choice wine first. When everyone goes to a party, you know that the best wine's brought out at the beginning, because that's when people know they can taste it. They've got their sense about them. They're drinking the good wine. And then after the guests have had a little too much to drink, right, you bring out the other wine. That's when the $2 chuck comes out, right? And so that's when you do, because the other guests, they're not going to know the difference at this point. You bring out the cheap wine, save some money. But not you, it says. But not you. You have saved the best until now. You're different. You did something no one expected, but not you. You saved the good stuff for the end. This isn't the cheap wine that everyone expected, but you brought the best out, and that's what God did with Jesus. When he set this covenant in place with Israel, it was to make their life better. It was to restore a relationship. It was to do all these great things. But when Jesus came, he said, that's all well and good for the Israelites, and maybe we tested that and it worked well for them, but we're going to take this thing global, and we're going to do something so much bigger. It's not going to be for one group. It's going to be for this whole world. And just as the original wine set the table for the better wine that was to come, Jesus and God set forth something and established a new covenant with Jesus. A new covenant that when John the Baptist, when he stood on the Jordan River, we talked about this 2 weeks ago, and he saw Jesus coming, he said, behold the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sin of the world. And that every Jewish person in attendance that day, and there were thousands, knew what he was talking about. And as they looked back on this story, they could tell that Jesus came to do something new. And that's why he chose to do it in the way that he did. He creates an illustration right there at a wedding. Right there when he didn't plan it this way, probably. His mom just kind of put him on the spot. And something new, something better was coming. And here's the thing. This wasn't just a miracle, though it was. This wasn't just a miracle that was done as a party favor. It wasn't just done to impress the whole crowd, because the whole crowd probably didn't know for days or months or years later maybe. It was a sign meant to point to something specific, a sign of what's to come. In John chapter 2 and in verse 11, he goes on, he says, what Jesus did here, what he just did here in Galilee was the first of the signs through which he used the signs to reveal his glory. That was the point of it. It wasn't to impress people. It was to reveal his glory. And his disciples, they saw it, they experienced it, they saw the evidence, and they believed in him. They had reason to believe. And John and Peter and these other disciples, their faith, and as we look back on it, their faith was so strong, and we believed that they believed, and they came to this through seeing, right? Many of them, they saw this stuff happen. John was there. He saw the water go in and the wine come out. And if you've ever made wine, that doesn't happen overnight. Right? That takes months, that takes years to get a really great wine. And this happened in an instant. They saw this stuff happen, and their faith came from seeing. And most of us in this room, that's probably not how our faith started. I don't know everybody's story, but some that might have happened. Something might have happened that you saw that caused your faith to begin. But most of us, our faith comes from hearing. comes from reading, comes from, experiencing these things. And that's what makes Christianity so much different than every other religion, is that we aren't asked to just believe. We aren't asked to just blindly believe or just muster up some faith and just agree with this whole thing. We are actually invited to believe based on the testimony of people who were there. People like John, people like Peter, who saw the miracles happen, who saw the signs, and they could look back and see what they pointed to. People like John who lived through such heartache, who saw such horrible, horrible things happen, who saw their friends brutally put to death, who saw thousands of Jews sold off into slavery, and all these terrible things happen to him. But through all of that experience, he saw the signs, and he was able to pen those famous words that even though all of this horrible stuff has happened and will continue to happen, that God so loved the world that he gave his son Jesus, who came down, who walked with us, who I met, who I ate with, who I walked with and did life with, that whoever believes in him can have life. John experienced it, and he was convinced by it. And he wrote this in John 1. He said that the Word became flesh. Those things that we'd read about over, that were written hundreds of years before, all of that stuff, like this coming Messiah, this person who was promised, all these words, that they became flesh, and he made his dwelling among us. And we read that, and we don't get, but with John, he actually dwelled with them. Jesus came and he walked with them. He lived with them. And we have seen his glory, as we're seeing it through the signs that he performed. The glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of both grace and truth, an equal balance of both. And he says, I was just a fisherman. I was just a bystander to all this. I saw this all unfold over time. This rabbi from Nazareth, he came and he did things that no one could explain. He brought forth these signs that pointed to things that we didn't even understand until years later. But I wrote all of these things down for a specific person, for a specific reason. And he said back in John chapter 20, that these are written that you and you and you and me, that we might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is who he said he is, the Son of God. And that by believing, that when you place your belief, when you have evidence to back that belief up, and you've looked through and you've figured it out, and you've read the accounts, and you have a basis for your faith because of evidence that's clearly documented in there, that when all of that is there, that then you may believe, and then you may have life in his name. That's what it's all about. My prayer is that as this series kind of unfolds, that you're going to build a case for faith, that you're going to be able to stand the test of time, that when hardship comes, you're going to be able to have something to fall back on. When you encounter that professor or that video on YouTube or you read that book, that you're going to say, I understand that says this, but I've experienced all of this, and I have evidence to pull back on, that I have real eyewitness accounts to base my faith on. See, we're not required to just believe. We're invited to review, to study, to pull our heads out of the sand, to look at Jesus and his life and those who walked with him and talked with him, and we're invited to believe. You've not been called to follow Jesus because of faith. It's way, 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 way better than that. I promise. And if you were ever talked out of it at one point or another because you were never talked into it in the first place, then I encourage you, as I leave you on the cliff, to come back next week for part 2 of our series, Bystander. Would you guys stand with me? We're going to pray. God, we love you. We thank you for your word, God. We thank you that we can trust in you. We thank you for the evidence that's so clear, and that we can look back and we can research and not be worried about what we might find, God, but that we can be confident in the words that we have read. We can have confidence that you are who you say you are. We thank you for your word, God. pray for these amazing people, that you be with them this week. We thank you for Todd and the healing that is taking place in his body. And we just pray for a great week. In your name we pray. Amen.